I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're reviewing the new Isuzu MU-X. The Isuzu MU-X is a bit of a favourite here in Australia. This style of ute-based wagon is really popular in this country and also throughout Southeast Asia, which is actually where most of them are sourced. The MU-X, like the previous generation, is built in Thailand, but it's a vehicle that is really attuned to the tastes of people here in Australia who like the idea of a country touring wagon, but also a vehicle that's really well suited for towing, and that's exactly the market that the MU-X is aimed at. However, I think even the most rusted on fan of the previous MU-X could probably have admitted that it could have used a bit more grunt and a bit more comfort and refinement, and that's basically what Isuzu have done with the second generation or the latest generation MU-X here in Australia, and we're going to check that out in today's video. But good news for those people will be that this package is still built around basically the same 3-litre diesel 4-cylinder engine that has such a well-earned reputation for durability, and we're going to be checking out the engine specs, the off-roading specs, and the increased towing and payload of the car before we get into the rest of the review. After that, we'll check out the interior, which is improved quite considerably, the second and third row practicality, the boot space, and then we'll head out on the road in the new Isuzu MU-X. A reminder, you can use the chapter bar below the video to skip to the part you want to see. While you're down there, make sure to hit subscribe. And now let's get on with this MU-X review. Now, the MU-X that I've brought along for today's review is the mid-spec LSU, which is actually a bit of a value pick in the range. The thing is that prices are up quite considerably across the MU-X range, even though in the engine department there hasn't been much of a change, but most buyers of this car wanted that to stay the same. And so we do have an upgraded version of the previous car's 3-litre turbo diesel 4-cylinder engine. It now makes a bit more power and torque, 140 kilowatts of power and 450 Newton meters of torque. And as we'll see when we get the MU-X out for a drive later in this review, that actually does make a bit of a difference. But it's actually the upgrades to the MU-X's capabilities that are going to impress potential buyers the most. So maximum brake towing capacity is up by another 500 kilos to 3.5 tons. So you can put something very substantial behind this car, more substantial than some of its rivals at least. And other capabilities like the wading depth of the four-wheel drive versions is 800 millimeters, which is really quite deep and competitive with some of the most capable off-roading vehicles on the market here in Australia. Equally, gross combination mass for the car is up by 150 kilos for the 4x4 and 250 kilos for the 4x2. You can still save quite a lot of money by opting for a rear-wheel drive version of the MU-X rather than a 4x4, so that is something that you can keep up your sleeve. Jumping up here into the cabin of the MU-X, you really see that a lot of attention has been poured onto improving the interior design of this car, and compared to the previous generation, which was not only really dated by this point but also relatively low rent in the cabin, the new MU-X is something of a revelation. It's still fairly hardy and durable in terms of most of the materials in here, but the design is so much more presentable. Now, it's based around this new touchscreen, which is pretty big, 9 inches in size. Just like on the D-Max, the actual underlying Isuzu software is a bit cumbersome, a bit immature looking in terms of graphics, but you don't really have to worry about that because wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto are standard on this car. It takes about a minute after you start the engine to kick in, but once it does, you've got modern smartphone-driven infotainment that works really well. One bugbear I know some people have though is that we do have wireless CarPlay here, but we don't have wireless charging. So when your phone runs flat, which happens quite quickly using wireless mirroring, you'll need to plug it into one of the USB ports or the 12-volt socket. But still, the screen works well. It keeps the glare off because it has a sort of film on it, and the speakers in the car are actually relatively decent too. Now, the base spec of the MU-X is relatively basic. It's kind of a fleet special, rental car special, but here in the mid-spec LSU, it gets a bit nicer. So we've got a leather steering wheel with white stitching that looks and feels good, leather shifter, and actually really quite comfortable and supportive cloth seats. And if you're going to be doing a lot of touring through hot environments, the LSU is going to be the spec that you'll want because these cloth seats are not going to heat up, and they actually are really good to sit in, but they're manually adjustable and they're not heated. and spending another 6 or 7 grand above this car on the LST flagship is going to suit some people because it swaps in heated, quilted, power adjustable leather seats and some other goodies like tire pressure monitoring, which some people are going to find attractive, as well as remote engine start. But here at the LSU level, you've got most of what you need. It's a practical cabin, storage ahead of the shifter, decent cup holders, bottle holders in the doors, storage up here for a pair of sunnies, and you know, most of the materials take a step up. We've got soft-ish pads down here astride this center console. We've got a soft leatherette pad on the dashboard. Sadly, even at this fairly premium price, the door skins are still hard, but you know, you've got all your bona fides like plenty of grab handles and a comfy, well-situated armrest between the seats. The MU-X is a 7-seat SUV, but here in the second row, it really is quite spacious, and you'll see shortly that you can say something similar about the third row. So it's actually quite a well-packaged vehicle. It is a bigger vehicle in terms of length, but it's not as high, so the proportions are a little bit more attractive from the outside. Now, space here in the second row, as I mentioned, is good. For myself, it's 6 foot. Headroom is acceptable. Legroom is really good behind my own driving position, and tow room is fine. Now, being a body-on-frame vehicle, we are sitting on a slightly higher floor plan, but Isuzu have been smart about it. The seat squab here in the back is both longer than usual and also inclined up a little bit, so it does support your legs even though your feet are sitting higher than they would be in a car-based SUV. In terms of amenities back here, it's not too bad. So we do have roof situated air vents for both the second and the third row, impressively. We've got airbags back here as well, so stretching back pretty far. Then we have a quite substantial armrest with cup holders integrated into it, which is cool. Plus 2 more USB ports here in the back and a little feature taken from the D-Max Ute, which is this little hook here that you can hang a coat or a bag off. If you're sitting up the front, you'll be able to still reach that pretty easily. Now, we do have kind of soft armrests on the doors, but like the front, it's still really hard. But if you're going off-roading with this car, which is something the MU-X is pretty good at, you'll benefit from the fact that passengers have pretty good access to these grab handles too. Getting into the third row of the MU-X here in Australia, a left-hand traffic market, is actually pretty easy. Even though the second row is 60-40 with the big piece on the curb side, which is usually something that we don't like, Isuzu have engineered a really good, easy seat tumbling mechanism, and there's actually much more space than usual to climb through that. And then once you're back here, you find it's nice and spacious, although bringing the seat back up is a bit more of a mission, because you kind of have to reach right forward and pull this back. But once you've done that, the MU-X is decent. So headroom, no worries really. Legroom is good. You can get 2 back here for short or moderate distance trips without too many complaints, I reckon. Here around the back of the MU-X, I'll just make a brief comment on the design of the vehicle, which I feel has actually improved over the previous gen. The previous car I always felt was not offensive, but it just looked really generic, and it looked quite a lot like a rebodied Holden Colorado. And of course, those cars had, or Trailblazer I should say, those cars had quite the shared progenesis, whereas the new MU-X is completely independent of that old GM arrangement that Isuzu used to have. I think the interesting question will be whether or not Mazda ends up doing a version of the MU-X. You'll remember that with the D-Max, the underlying Ute that shares a platform with this car, that now shares its platform as well with the Mazda BT50. But as far as we know, Mazda don't plan to do an MU-X clone. Anyway, here on the mid-spec LSU, you do get a powered tailgate. It's not the quickest in the world, but it's certainly a benefit when you have your hands full. And that's opened up to reveal the amount of boot space that you have with 7 seats in play in this car. As I mentioned, the third row is actually relatively good in this vehicle, and even when that's in place, we can still get mid-size and small in here without too much of an issue. Isuzu say there's 311 litres of boot space in 7-seat mode with the SAE standard of measuring boots. I'll just get these out of the way so you can see how easy it is to flip down the third row. We do also have a full-size spare under the car, and you can see this vehicle is fitted with the Isuzu tow bar. Super easy to put the third row seat down. Anyone can do that. It's a bit of a reach back into the boot to erect the third row, however. Now, in 5-seat configuration, Again, with that SAE standard, we've got 1,119 litres of boot space. Now, SAE is definitely a more generous standard than VDA, which is what most car manufacturers use to measure their boots. So you can take that for what it is. But as you can see now, with all 3 suitcases in the boot of this vehicle, there's heaps of space. You'll get a whole camping trip away with not too much of a problem. And if you pack quite heavily, then you can hitch something up here at the back and take advantage of this car's particularly generous braked towing capacity. Then we again have the relatively lethargic beeping electric tailgate, but that lowers itself, and we can talk about running costs before we take the MU-X onto the road. Last step before we take the MU-X for a drive is to talk about the running costs of this vehicle, which are actually relatively attractive compared to some rivals. Let's start with servicing. The intervals are 12 months and 15,000 Ks. A slightly longer distance interval would definitely have been something people would have appreciated given the country touring demeanor of this car, but still, that's the way it is. But you get 7 years of cap price servicing from Isuzu, and the first 5 years and 75,000 Ks of that arrangement will set you back $2,215, which actually isn't bad for a vehicle like this, particularly the four-wheel drive version. In terms of insurance, over the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer spent $831 to insure a new Isuzu MU-X. Everybody's situation varies, and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, your driving history, who drives the car, etc. The warranty on the MU-X is 6 years and 150,000 kilometers, which is relatively generous, although something like a Pajero Sport is currently offered with 10 years of warranty. And lastly, fuel consumption. Over the last few hundred Ks of my driving, it's been returning very consistently 10 litres per 100 Ks of diesel consumption, which is not too bad. So what's the new MU-X like to drive? Well, the key thing to remember is that all MU-Xs use the same engine and the same automatic transmission. Really, the only mechanical choice is between 4x2 or rear wheel drive, or 4x4, which is fitted to this car with a proper transfer case and the ability to run in 2 high, as I am now on the blacktop, switchable 4 high and low range as well. So for anybody that wants to use this car's pretty decent off-roading capability, the 4x4 will make a lot of sense. But for people who actually want an MU-X, not necessarily to go too far off-road, but to tow something and do a bit of country touring, then the 4x2 is a great way to save quite a considerable sum of money actually. So let's start on the engine. We have an upgraded 3-litre diesel 4-cylinder turbo diesel, making 140 kilowatts of power and 450 Newton meters of torque. And we've already seen this upgraded 3-litre in the D-Max Ute and also the new Mazda BT50 that shares a platform with the D-Max. But Isuzu is the only one of the partners that builds a wagon version here in the MU-X. Mazda have kind of said they're not going to do it. I suppose we'll see, but personally I can't really see how that would fit into Mazda's SUV lineup. But anyway, I digress. This is about the Isuzu MU-X. Now, the great thing about this engine is that we know what goes into it. It's got a reputation for durability. It's tried and tested. Now, in the past, you used to have to balance that reputation against the fact that the old MU-X and the old D-Max were pretty clattery and unrefined. But thankfully, one of the main things that Isuzu have worked on for the new generation is to make this engine more powerful, more torquey, so thereby more effortless, but also more refined and better insulated, and they've done a pretty good job of that. So most of the time, the engine is really quiet in the MU-X, and it still has a really good torquey mid-range that you can cruise around on and, you know, accelerate at decent pace, but not having to hear too much. Now, naturally, being a 4-cylinder diesel, if I slow down a bit here and then I pin it, yeah, you're gonna hear it. And of course, revving out an engine like this, you're gonna generate a lot of noise, but not an awful lot of pace, because there isn't really any torque up there. So it's actually better just to let this car cruise on torque, which it does pretty well. Good partnership with the 6-speed auto gearbox here. That does a good job. It's also got a manual shift gate where you can override it and particularly tap into a bit more engine braking if you're towing, which is good. But the biggest difference between the old MU-X and this one, and also the biggest difference between a D-Max and the MU-X, is the refinement. This is a very comfortable touring wagon. It's certainly not as stable and as level as a car-based SUV, but among these ute-based wagons, body-on-frame vehicles, the MU-X is actually a pretty good example. There's a relatively restrained sensation of jittering through the chassis, which is the biggest thing that you feel when you're driving a frame vehicle on tarmac. It's pretty vibration free, it's comfy. As I mentioned before, the seats are actually really good and really supportive, so you can kind of settle into the MU-X a bit better than you can in several of this car's rivals. In particular, it feels more premium and more comfortable than a Fortuner, and also a bit more settled than a Pajero Sport, and that's kind of where Isuzu have got to get this car. Now, the Ford Everest is probably still the benchmark here. I think we do need to do a back-to-back comparo, but the Australian know-how and engineering in the Everest really helps that car feel particularly well planted and well suited on our roads. Now, equally, the steering is improved in the MU-X. It's a quicker rack. Steering wheel itself is a lot smaller, so that helps make it feel like the car's a little more responsive. The ratio can feel a little bit inconsistent. You get quite a lot of result when you start to turn the wheel, but it's almost as if it slows down after that and you have to add a bit more lock than you're expecting, but it's still a perfectly fine vehicle to steer. You know, the chassis on the new MU-X is actually decent. The weak point is surprisingly the stability control calibration, which is very conservative. So if you just turn the car in with a little bit too much pace on board on a country road, it snaps on the ESC like that, clamps down the brake immediately, and then actually cuts power for 3 or 4 seconds. And I think this is an area that needs work for a future update to this car, because it's just too clampy and snappy. And if you were towing and you had something pretty heavy behind the car, you don't want that clamping on the brake kind of so dramatically. You want a more linear bite, just a better tuned system. Same can be said for the safety tech, which is very generous. You get lane keep assist, adaptive cruise, AEB with junction assistance, all standard, but the tuning is aggressive. It's always correcting your line through the lane tracing, too much so. It overcorrects and it's too invasive, and it makes me worry that people will prefer to turn it off. So more tuning, going back to the drawing board on getting the sophistication of those technologies right is key. Having them is one thing, tuning them properly is another thing. So those are my detailed opinions on the new Isuzu MU-X. Basically, this car keeps the parts of the old vehicle that most people would have wanted it to keep, particularly that 4-cylinder engine, which does have such a reputation for durability, but it radically refines other aspects of the package. The interior is a much nicer place to spend time. The vehicle is much more comfortable and refined when you're proceeding down the road. So I think for most people, this would make a nice upgrade over the previous MU-X, and it does warrant consideration if you're looking for one of these off-roading wagons that's based on a ute. That being said, if you're looking for something a little bit more sophisticated and still with a really high towing capability, personally, I'd also look at options like the Volkswagen Touareg with the V6 diesel, because just with that under-stressed 6-cylinder engine, I'd probably feel more confident towing those really heavy loads. But it's hard to argue with the value of these ute-based vehicles compared to those sort of luxury spec SUVs. But you can let me know your thoughts down below this video. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.